on even over Zoom as we can. So we have the agenda lined up there on the right-hand side of your screen. That's how we will be doing the program. Today we have two of our modules, so one on grain production, the other on forages, both presented by two different specialists at the University of Maryland, who I will introduce later. First, my name is Andrew Ness. I'm an ag extension agent with the University of Maryland in Harford County, and I have my colleague Erica Crowell with me. She is from Baltimore County as the ag agent there. And just a reminder, folks, that this session is being recorded just for viewing later. So if you have any issues with that, just let us know. But it is being recorded and it will be on file for viewing later. So I would like to start us off. If my clicker would work. Okay, so I'm actually going to start us off with our first module here, which is an introduction to Maryland agriculture, just sort of a very quick view of ag in Maryland. I'm not going to talk too much in detail because the rest of our speakers will be doing that. But before I get started, again, thank you to USDA, NRCS for sponsoring and supporting the development of this program through a grant. So we greatly appreciate them with their support and their support and collaboration all through this project. So a couple of housekeeping items before we start. Erica sent out a pre-course survey to you guys last week and a reminder yesterday. So we would like to thank everyone who filled out that pre-course survey already. So thank you guys so much for doing that. And then after the conclusion of the second class tomorrow, we will send out a post-course survey. And even if you didn't fill out the pre-course survey, we would certainly appreciate if you took time to do the post-course survey as well. It will help us gauge how well we did and try to make this program better moving forward. So another item that you guys got yesterday was the Ag 101 handbook. This is it's sort of a summary document of the program, and it also lists some resources that will be referenced in these presentations. So it's a PDF file with clickable links that you guys can explore on your own time or follow along as the speakers go through their presentations. And also after the conclusion of the program tomorrow, we will be sending, eventually we will be sending you guys all a flash drive that has the handbook in it, as well as references, resources, and the presentations from our speakers. And that will be mailed to you so you can have it all in one spot for reference later on down the road. Just some reminders, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, the way we're going to handle questions is going to be through the chat feature. So if you guys have any questions at any point during any of the presentations, just click on the little chat box, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, you can type in your chat. You can type in your questions. Just do that at any time, and either the presenters or myself or Erica will help monitor those questions and ensure that they get answered. If you have something that's more of a interactive type discussion question, maybe more involved, that's not easily typed out, you can certainly unmute yourself and with the unmute button there on the left-hand side and ask your question that way. And we do have some time built in before breaks and at the end of each day for some discussion and questions if you have any. So hopefully everybody is well versed in Zoom and we can get started. So again, I'm going to start us off with an intro to Maryland ag. Again, this is going to be sort of a 30,000 foot view of agriculture in the state. I wanted to start off by mentioning where you can find ag statistics for Maryland and really for the United States. If you ever have any need or use for it, there's some good resources. The main sort of data set is going to be through the USDA NASS, which is the National Ag Statistics Service. They collect data from farms all over the country. They do a census. So the National Ag Census is conducted every 5 years. Most recent data set for the Ag Census is the 2017 census. And USDA also collects annual data from a subset of farmers through a survey. So there's two different data sets in the NASS website. You can see the snapshot of the website on the right-hand side. So you can access data from both of those data sets. And it can take some time to explore, but there's a lot of interesting information in there that you could use for all sorts of work-related needs. The second data source of data would be through the Maryland Department of Agriculture, or MDA. These data are similar to the USDA data, and a lot of it is overlapping data from the NASS data. And Maryland Department of Ag also generates a summary of Maryland agriculture every year, so that can be accessed through the Maryland Department of Ag's website. And then I listed this third bullet point. This is the Marbidco study. They conduct a economic impact of agriculture in the state of Maryland. So this can be a really great source of information to get true economic impact of agriculture in the state of Maryland. And that Marbidco study is linked in the Ag 101 handbook. So just by the numbers, these data are from the USDA, NASS data. So in Maryland, we have about 12,400 farms on about 2 million acres of land. And both the number of farms and the acreage in farmland in the state of Maryland has held pretty consistent over the last few years at both 2 million acres and 12,400 farms. You can see on the right-hand side, there is farms by size, so you can get a relative idea of the size of the farms in Maryland. So you can see the significant number of farms in Maryland are somewhere less than 500 acres. However, we do have about 900 or so farms that are over that 500 acre mark. It comes out to be about 160 acres average is the average size farm in Maryland. And 96% of those farms are family owned operations. And that's consistent with national data that is well into the 90s that farms are family owned and operated. Some of the demographic information for farms in Maryland is pictured there on the right-hand side of your screen. Quite a few female operators as well. Total producers is at just about 21,000. And USDA limits the number of producers that they collect in their survey to 4 per operation. So that number could actually be higher than that if there are more than 4 per farm. And you can see the age demographics of our farmers. We do have a significant proportion of them that are above the age of 35 and again over 65. And that again is consistent with national trends that the average age of the American farmer is getting is higher and higher all the time. You can also see the race demographics pictured on the right as well. And again, this is all from the NASS data. I wanted to briefly mention sort of the landscape of agriculture in the state of Maryland, just by acreage. So about 33% of Maryland's total usable land mass is actually farmland, which is pretty good for the East Coast. It actually ranks 16th in the entire nation for farmland. And by the numbers, the dominant crops in the state of Maryland are going to be the ones that I listed here. So there's about 500,000 acres each of corn and soybeans in the state of Maryland, about 350,000 acres of wheat and barley combined that are grown About 185,000 acres are forages, so that would include any of our forage crops as well as pastures and hay. And then finally, I wanted to mention 500,000 acres of cover crops. I'm not going to go into the detail about really any of this a whole lot because I know Nicole is next, but the cover crops are certainly a shining point in Maryland agriculture. And Maryland is a national leader in a lot of in conservation practices when it comes to cover crops. So cover crops pictured on the right that are planted in sort of the off seasons and growing, which stabilize soil and nutrient runoff. And as well as the use of conservation tillage practices like no-till. And you can see the picture on the left of a cornfield that's been planted into a field without tilling it. So if you look at the numbers, these are two different studies. Maryland ranks very high in both percent of commodity acres and cover crops. Maryland is actually ranked number one. Around 43% of the commodity acres are planted into cover crops each year. And our next closest one on that list would be Virginia at 48%. And then the table on the left is looking at no-till practices. So Tennessee and Maryland are number one and number two as far as number of the percent of their acres in no-till production, which is 78% for Tennessee and 74% for Maryland. So Maryland is a national leader in those fronts, and it is quite unique for us. If you look at economic data, the total value of products, this is from cash receipts. This is data from the USDA NAS census. They put it at about $2.4 billion. That number is likely very low just because the folks that are filling out the survey kind of don't want the government to know their economics. So that number is likely low, but it is 2.4 billion nonetheless. The livestock sector of agriculture make up 62% of those sales, and that is predominantly through sales from poultry, which is the broiler industry, mainly on the eastern shore of Maryland. If you look at Marbidco's study that they did and looking at the total economic impact of agriculture in the state of Maryland, it comes out to be somewhere close to $20 billion in economic activity and supporting about 84,000 jobs. So very significant impact, and obviously a lot of jobs created through agriculture in the state of Maryland. And then finally, I just wanted to throw up a picture of the state of Maryland and make a few generalizations here. Of course, there are going to be exceptions to what I say, but in general, you can sort of find these types of agriculture in these different regions of the state. So if you look at the northern tier counties that butt up against the Pennsylvania line, this is predominantly where you're going to find a lot of the dairies in our state. There's also going to be a lot of beef cattle here. You're going to still find horses. You're going to find a lot of corn and soybeans grown. You're going to find forage crops grown to feed the cattle and the livestock. There are orchards in the northern parts of Maryland, as well as nurseries, greenhouses, and fresh market vegetables that are sold in things like farmers markets and CSAs. On the Eastern Shore, we have predominantly the poultry industry, as well as a lot of corn and soybeans. And there's also some nursery production and commercial and processing vegetables found on the shore. In Southern Maryland, this is where we'll find some more fresh market vegetables. You'll still find corn and soybeans. You'll find livestock. And traditionally, this is where our tobacco industry used to be very strong. And that's still where our tobacco is grown in the state. And then finally, I just want to throw up sort of the Central Maryland. This sort of overlaps a couple of others, but again, grain like soybeans and corn, going to be livestock as well as horses, and also nursery and greenhouses in this region as well. So that is sort of the overview, quick overview of Maryland agriculture. I didn't want to go into too much detail because I know the rest of our speakers throughout the program are going to do a really good job of doing explaining that better. So this is my contact information here. If you guys have questions, please reach out to me or enter them in the chat box. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Nicole.
Thanks. Good morning.
Dr. Nicole Fiorino is our agronomist here with University of Maryland Extension, and she is going to speak about the grain industry. And I will let Nicole take it away however you want to proceed.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm going to turn my video off, but I figured I would just say hi, and so everyone could see that I was here. Let me get my screen up. Oh, I'm not able to share my screen, Andy and Erica. So while we're getting that worked out, as Andy mentioned, I am the extension agronomist for University of Maryland. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. So what that means is I do research and I do extension related to all the agronomic crops here in the state of Maryland. And hopefully you all can see my PowerPoint presentation now. So I was really excited to do this program, and it was great listening to Andy's overview as I look at my first slide, and it is the exact same one that Andy just showed. But it just goes to show that when we all come together and put these seminars together, it's actually always good to hear an overlap of some of this information, and hopefully the audience sees that, you know, we are very consistent in our messaging. I also happen to just love this image, this map. I have a laminated copy of this in my office, and I like to look at it frequently. When I first moved to Maryland, when I was in graduate school, it was a good reminder of where the counties were, and as Andy said, kind of what was happening in the different regions and the different parts of the state. And so I think Andy really set the stage with making the point that I was going to make, is that we have a very diverse agriculture industry here in our state, which is kind of different than when we think about some of the larger Midwest states, right? We think about the Corn Belt. I'm going to be referencing that a lot. You know, when we think of those Midwest states, we tend to think of, you know, a monoculture, a monocrop. It's called the Corn Belt for a reason, right? Because we think, wow, all they really do is grow corn out there. And that's really not the scenario that we have in the state of Maryland. We are a very diverse state where we are pairing, you know, animal production, areas of concentrated animal production with crop production to be able to feed those animals. And so as Andy alluded to, I like to show this image too, because I think, again, it really kind of hits home the importance of animal agriculture in our small state. And so when we look at this map, which isn't quite to scale, but it's close enough, when we look at ourselves kind of up here, so each one of these small tiny dots is representing 1 million broilers. Those are meat chickens. Those are the kinds of chickens that we produce here in the state of Maryland. When we look at like just our tiny Delmarva Peninsula, there's dots upon dots upon dots upon dots. And so, you know, we are such a small geographic area of the country, but we are extremely important in terms of, you know, broiler production, this kind of animal production across the country. And so I just like to, you know, really set the stage and kind of frame our discussion, even though we will be talking about crops, but framing our discussion and thinking about why we are producing those crops. And so, you know, as Andy discussed, talking about conservation practices and cover crops, which I am going to talk about in a little bit, you know, one of the unique things about the state of Maryland, and, you know, we are a leader in conservation practices and things like cover crops, but I dare say we are kind of the beginning and the leaders in terms of the ideas of nutrient management, which I think most states are doing in some form in some way, but I think we were really the first state to move away from this idea of voluntary nutrient management to, you know, this is our regulation and these are the practices that are supported by our government. And so really when we talk about nutrient management, we mean what it says, right? Managing the way that we apply our nutrients. And the goal is to really make sure we're minimizing the loss of those nutrients that damage our sensitive surrounding environment, right? We are surrounded by, we all live and work in the Chesapeake Bay region. And while there are 6 states that all drain into the Chesapeake Bay, I think we feel we see and we feel the effects of that damage to our environment. And I think it really motivates us, our farmers, our producers, everyone in the state, to really take care of our sensitive environment, you know. And another unique aspect of nutrient management, why it's so important in the state of Maryland, is that we are utilizing those animal manures, that waste that is formed by the production of our animals, to fertilize our crops, which is maybe a little bit different thinking than, again, some of those Midwest states that are really using commercial fertilizers to fertilize and feed their crops. So let's look at some visuals here, and we'll talk about kind of what I mean. All right, so let's look at this example on this slide. And these yellow bars represent our major macronutrients that all plants need to grow. So NPK, you probably have all heard that in some sense: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So these nutrients are required by crops to grow. And we're not worrying about the numbers here. I simply want to point out the visual that, you know, for corn to grow, it needs a certain amount of nitrogen, maybe a little less phosphorus, and a little less potassium. The amounts don't really matter here, but just know that the crops need some amount of nutrients to grow. Now, in the other states, most of the other states that are using commercial fertilizer, even some of the folks here in Maryland that are using commercial fertilizer, you can simply go to a fertilizer dealer and say, I need a blend of this much nitrogen, this much phosphorus, this much potassium, to really align with and to meet with the requirements of our crop. We don't want to over fertilize. That costs money. That hurts our sensitive environment. And so when we're creating a custom blend of fertilizer, we can really match those needs. So just the right amount of phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen for that plant. Very easy, nice and balanced. Those bars are about at the same height. This becomes a little tricky when we're using animal manures like poultry litter, for example. We can't necessarily control the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that's in that poultry litter, right? There may be some amount of nitrogen that's maybe close to what that corn plant needs, but there might be more phosphorus, there might be more potassium. We can't control that the same way that we can control our fertilizer blend that we can make. So what does that mean for our growers? If we are using poultry litter or other animal manures to fertilize our growing crop, if we decide we want to meet the nitrogen need of that growing crop with our animal manure, well, then there's the potential that we could be applying more phosphorus than that crop would need. All right. Again, putting our environment at risk. There could potentially be losses of that phosphorus into our estuary, into our Chesapeake Bay, into some other rivers and streams. Okay. Another option is we'll say, all right, well, I will put down less of that poultry litter, and I will only meet the phosphorus requirement of my growing plant. Well, but then I may be lacking. That plant is going to be lacking in nitrogen. I'm going to have to go out and purchase commercial fertilizer. This is going to be expensive. What do I do, right? How do farmers decide the best way to manage their nutrients? Again, balancing the needs, the sensitive environmental situation that we are in right now. And this is what is the nutrient management planning process, right? Farmers sit down every year, maybe every other year, with an advisor, either a private consultant or a nutrient management advisor that works through the University of Maryland Extension. And those advisors sit down with every farmer, go through each individual field, look at those individual field conditions, talk with the grower about their plans for the upcoming season. And during this planning session, the advisors can provide management recommendations to those farmers, and they can decide how they're going to move forward with their plans for the next growing season. All right, this is actually a very great program, and I think we have come a long way nationally in really setting the stage and leading the way for other states to kind of follow suit with what we are doing here in Maryland. Okay, so enough about that. Let's get in and talk a little bit about the actual crops, the actual grains that we produce in the state, what they're used for, kind of how they are produced at this point. All right. And again, Andy set me up perfectly with his slides. I'm really going to focus on really our main top 3 crops. And Dr. Grev, after me in the next module, is going to move on and talk about our forages. So I want to start off with our 3 kind of main crops, corn, soybean, and wheat, that we do produce here in the state of Maryland. So as mentioned, I think I mentioned this already, grains that we produce in the state of Maryland are almost exclusively used to feed the poultry that we produce, as well as the other livestock that we produce in the state. What's interesting is that we actually don't produce enough grain to feed all of the chickens that we produce here in the state of Maryland. We actually end up importing from other states corn, soybean, other grains to really fulfill the needs, the feed needs of our poultry industry. With that, we have a small amount of grain that does, is exported globally into other countries, but it's a really very small amount of grain that's exported. And so the bulk, the vast majority of grain that is produced in Maryland is used for feed in the poultry industry, which I think is a reason why we still have a very robust grain industry in the state of Maryland. We really can't compete against some of the larger states. As Andy alluded to, we've got fairly small farms in the state of Maryland. And so it really is that poultry industry, it really is our livestock that is driving the grain that is produced in the state of Maryland. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit when we talk about economics as well. All right, so let's start off with corn. I should have worn my corn earrings again today. So corn, this is probably our biggest, well, corn and soybean are tied, kind of as Andy said, in terms of the grains that are produced. Typically you see corn planted late April, early May, kind of depends on the conditions of the year, and it's beautiful and green in the summer. Hopefully when you guys think about summer, you think about, green corn out in the fields. I know that I sure do. And as we enter the fall, as we enter late August, early September, just like we are now, we start seeing that corn dry down. That's kind of like our sign that fall is coming. And as we move into September and through October, we start seeing that corn being harvested. Maybe depending on where you're located in the state, you may have seen corn harvest already start, lower Eastern Shore. I'm located on the upper Eastern Shore. We're kind of getting into it. We've had a little bit of rain, so it's kept us out of the fields. And so depending on where you are in the state, corn harvest is going to be ramping up here soon. We had a cool kind of wet spring this year. I know some of our research plots, we were a little delayed getting planted. It was just I'm not as risky as some, and I wasn't comfortable planting as early. So we're going to see delayed harvest this year. I pulled off some of the NASS, the National Ag Statistics Survey data, just to give folks an idea of kind of the general yields that we may see. So NASS reported about 160 bushels per acre of corn as an average yield for Maryland. I would say, and you'll hear me say this for all the crops, our good producers are definitely seeing higher yields, especially on fields where there is some type of irrigation and growers have been able to make sure their corn has ample moisture throughout the growing season. We definitely see a lot higher yields, but most of our corn is not produced under irrigation, dry land, and so I think that kind of pulls down the average that we see here. But our good producers are definitely seeing higher yields than this for their corn crop. All right, next we'll talk about wheat, then we'll pop back over to soybeans. And so wheat, I was trying to follow the order of how a rotation might go here. So after that corn typically is harvested in the fall, that's when you're going to see folks getting out and planting their wheat and other small grains like barley. Although Andy's numbers, he kind of lumped wheat and barley together, and I would report it the same way. There's not a huge proportion of barley being produced because there really isn't necessarily a great market for it here. And so our wheat gets planted in the fall, typically after harvest time. You'll see a very small, like little bit of growth in the fall. You'll see that wheat pop up. It'll look nice and green. It almost looks like a nice green lawn. And then that plant kind of goes dormant. There's not a lot of growth happening over the winter time. And as we start seeing those temperatures warm up in the spring, then we're going to see that rapid spring growth, getting tall, getting green, looking lush. And then those plants continue growing throughout the spring season, and they're typically harvested around June, typically before we go into soybean planting. So while wheat is a small proportion of our poultry and livestock feed, the majority of the wheat that gets produced in Maryland actually gets transported north up to our neighbors to the north, Pennsylvania, and is typically used for pretzel and some kind of some cookie production kind of in the area. So there are different types of wheats that are produced all across the country. Different types of wheats are used for bread and pasta, but the type of wheat that we grow here that's really suited to our climate is best meant for kind of pretzel and cookie production. Again, the National Ag Statistics Service estimated about 75 bushels per acre, and that's probably an average to low yield. I think some of our good growers are probably seeing, you know, upwards of over 100 bushels per acre yield if they're doing a really good job and managing their crop really well. So again, the NASS data is important and it gives you a good snapshot, but we do sometimes have to take that a bit with a grain of salt because that really is the average of everyone together. All right, let's talk a little bit about soybeans. And so when we talk about soybeans, there's really two different kind of production systems when we're talking about soybeans. And so when we talk about full season soybeans, these are typically planted in April or May, kind of about the time that folks are planting corn. It's all kind of happening at the same time, growing through the summer months and then harvested in the fall time. We also can plant soybeans in a double cropping system, which means after our wheat is harvested in June, soybeans can be planted. They still will have enough time to grow and be productive, and they would get harvested about the same time as our full season soybeans. But we call them double crop because you will get two cash crops kind of per year. And so you'll have that wheat harvest and then you'll have that soybean harvest. And so our growers definitely take advantage of the fact that our environment, our growing conditions set them up for the ability to grow double crop soybeans. Not every part of the country really has those conditions to be able to do that. So again, soybeans are important. They are a component of poultry and livestock diets. Sometimes soybean fields, as you may have noticed, they're shorter, they don't get as tall, they don't form the same kind of canopy that cornfields do. And so sometimes we have an issue of dealing with weeds. Just as those plants are small, as they get up before they kind of fill that canopy, you know, especially as we talk about some of our herbicide resistant weeds, we tend to be a little more concerned with them in our soybean fields than we are in our corn fields that form a better, quicker canopy. What's interesting about soybeans, we have some varieties, some hybrids of soybeans that are bred to have a specific fatty acid profile in their oil. So the soybeans are actually pressed and the grain is pressed to form oil. And that oil contains a specific profile of those fatty acids. And really what that means is a higher income, a higher price for our growers at the end of the season. And again, that NASS data, 44 bushels per acre, again, that's a little low. I'd say a lot of our good growers are definitely seeing higher yields than that for their soybeans. Okay, so those are our major crops. I did want to make a point, and I think anyone who has, spent time driving around Maryland, during the growing season, around the summer, maybe not this year if you were a little cooped up due to quarantine, but I think something that you'll notice driving around, whatever county it is that you'll live in, you drive around and you'll see, there are some fields that have corn in them, some fields that have soybean in them. And I think that's, again, something that really makes our state very unique. Instead of when driving through the Midwest and it's just hours of driving past nothing but cornfields, in our state, we really see at any given time, one farmer has fields that are in a different sequence of this crop rotation. There's some fields that are in corn, there's some fields that are in soybean, some fields are going to go to wheat next, some fields may go to a cover crop next. And so our producers are not typically managing large swaths of land that are all the same crop. There's a couple, maybe some of those big farmers, those few, maybe in that 10% that Andy showed that have those large acres. But for the most part, our average farmers are going to have fields on each farm that are in different stages of that rotation. Again, something that sets us apart from, other states throughout the country. Okay, so I want to walk through our process of really from start to finish, how we get that crop growing, how we get that crop in the ground, manage it through the season, and harvest it at the end. And I really am purposefully showing a lot of pictures here, just so folks get a feel for what the equipment looks like that is necessary for all these different operations. And, it really is necessary for our growers to have a variety of different equipment available to them to really go through this growing season, and the option for growers, if they don't have this equipment available, is to, pay someone to come out and help them out and use their equipment. But, agriculture is a very equipment, capital intensive kind of business. And I think you'll get a feel for that as just kind of seeing the images of the equipment as we move through. So starting in the spring, before we're really even thinking about getting our crop in the ground, we really need to make sure we are preparing that soil, preparing that seed bed for planting. And one way that we do that is through tillage. And so you see example of a nice tractor here. I'm going to preface with saying I have no color or brand preference. I simply tried to find the best picture to illustrate the point that I was trying to make. So I work for the university. I don't sell any equipment, and I don't have any personal preference myself. And so you'll see this image happens to be a green tractor here, and you can see the tillage implement that's being pulled behind it. All right, and we're going to talk a little bit about these different types of tillage in a second here. But first, why do we do tillage? Why is tillage important? And maybe some people think tillage is a bad word. I would tend to disagree about that. But I think it is really important that we want to prepare that soil prior to planting seed. We want that seed, that baby seed, to be nestled in, be tucked into the soil, really be in good contact with the soil, because that's where it's water and that's where the nutrients are going to come from to feed that plant, right? We got to set that seed and that plant up for success from the beginning. And so making sure we have good seed to soil contact, that seed is in the right spot for its particular growth habit, is really important, okay? Tillage is great for breaking up the soil surface. Sometimes we tend to get a little bit of crusting from hard rain, or if we have runoff. And again, we're not going to be able to get that seed in the right place in the soil if the surface isn't kind of broken up and fluffy and providing a good home for that seed. Tillage is also good for incorporating residue, nutrients that may have been applied on the surface, like manure, weed seeds. Get those weed seeds. We don't want weeds. Get them buried kind of underneath and in the soil and hope that they won't emerge. So incorporating nutrients and residue is really important, again, to get those nutrients into the soil so it can get into the seed. Reducing compaction. So as we run our harvest equipment across the fields in the fall, you'll see some images here as we go through. that can create compaction. Running, you know, large heavy equipment back and forth across the soil can really compact it. Again, that's not a desirable home for our seed. And so tillage can really fluff up, break up that compaction, really increase warming and drying of the soil in the spring so that farmers can get out on the field sooner and get that seed planted sooner. All right, those are the positives. There's pros and cons of everything, right? Excessive tillage, too much tillage can sometimes lead to erosion or runoff. So soil erosion is where entire particles of soil move with water and can, you know, rain, snow melt, move entire particles of soil into a receiving water body, stream, a ditch. Runoff could be where soluble nutrients, maybe even manure that was spread, just moves across that soil surface into a ditch or into a stream. And we really want to avoid that, all right? There's a balance between the pros and cons. There's also some different types of tillage. And so the first box here is talking about conventional tillage, where really your kind of first step is going to be a plow, maybe some type of moldboard plow that's really going to invert or flip over that soil. Then second step, that farmer may come back with a disc and just kind of flatten out and really even out the surface of that soil. Then the farmer would come through with planting, and after planting may come through cultivation as those plants are starting to pop up, or maybe even before, just running across that surface to try to cut down on some of those weeds. This is really something that I will say, and again, Andy showed those statistics at the beginning to really kind of set this up. This is not something that's really popular anymore in the state of Maryland. I will say that driving around, and maybe it was 2 years ago, a farmer near where I live actually moldboard plowed their field. And to be quite frank, I had not seen a moldboard plow. I had not seen a field that had been moldboard plowed, and it looked so foreign to me. It's really not something that's commonly practiced here in the state of Maryland. This is also very time consuming. This is 4 different trips across the field. That's time and that's fuel that farmer has to invest in going across that field, all right? As Andy mentioned, most of our folks are practicing some kind of conservation tillage, some type of conservation practice, right? So this reduced tillage scenario really eliminates that first plowing step, which most folks have found isn't really necessary. So eliminating a whole step, a whole trip across the field, and minimizing the disturbance to really avoid erosion and runoff. And so I would say most folks in the state of Maryland that are still using some type of tillage are using this reduced tillage scenario, light disking to kind of break up the soil surface, then planting, and maybe coming back and doing some cultivation later. While folks that are practicing no-till have really eliminated, 3 of those 4 potential trips across the field. They're really just coming out, planting, and maybe they're spraying, burning down, killing some of that that surface residue while they're planting, and that's really it. They're really not coming through and disturbing their soil and really mixing up the soil. Again, nothing is good, nothing is bad. These are just different options that growers have available to them. All right, so let's look at some pictures. I love looking at pictures. So bottom right-hand corner, this is an example of that moldboard plow. So you can see as this tractor is going across the field, the left side of the bottom right image has not been tilled yet. You can see that this soil has been fully inverted. This plow is coming over and pulling these plants up and flipping them over, almost like a wave of soil. Like a wave in the ocean, a wave of soil, completely burying all that residue, and really all you're seeing on the surface is bare soil. I don't even feel that this picture can do it justice of just how much disturbance there is. And so the point is, you see there really is no residue. It's all been completely buried. If we move up to the top right image here, this is disking. This is kind of that idea of conservation tillage. So you can see that farmer is moving across the field, but there really is still a lot of residue left on the surface. This is really just breaking up that soil surface. Again, making sure there's a nice, comfortable home for that seed when you plant it, but really not burying and disturbing too much of that residue that's on the surface, which is good. We want that residue on the surface, as Andy said, to really kind of hold our soil in place. That's what's going to prevent that erosion and that runoff. On the top left corner, we have an example of strip till. So you notice that there's just, the soil has been disturbed right behind where these coulters are, but in between, this is no-till. There's no tillage happening here. We see residue from the previous crops. We see some green growing crops. So this is really another option of minimizing that disturbance, but making sure that we're preparing that seed bed for where that seed is going to be, but really not disturbing the entire field in the process. Bottom left corner here is an example of no-till, a really pretty looking example. You see our growing crop here, our nice green growing crop, and you see our residue, you see that corn stubble from the previous year. Hasn't been tilled in, hasn't been pushed under the surface, still standing straight up with that residue covering the soil on the top of the soil there. Looks great. So, how do farmers decide what type of tillage they're going to use? Is it always right or is it always wrong to till your fields? I like to reframe this question as to till or not to till, right? Is there a right or wrong answer? And I would argue no, that these are all examples of tools, and farmers have to decide what their individual goals and their individual field conditions, will allow them to do. What is the best tillage practice for their individual conditions? So are you in a long-term no-tillage farming system? Is that your goal, to remain no-till for the long term? If so, then you're not going to use tillage on your operation. If you have certain soil types that are prone to compaction, maybe there needs to be some tillage involved. How much residue do I want to leave on the surface? All right. What type of tillage can I use to maybe maximize that residue that's left on the surface? And, I will say this, that I don't think that this has to be an all or none option. This doesn't have to be, I till every year or I don't till every year. Tillage, just like your crops, happen in a rotation. There could be tillage in a rotation. You don't have to till every field every year, and you don't have to never till a field. Maybe every handful of years, the compaction gets bad enough and you need to employ some tillage. The rest of the rotation is no-till. Really, again, these are just tools in the toolbox. Farmers really do need to think about, why am I tilling? And how do I match the type of operation, the type of tillage practice to the reason that I'm tilling? Preparing the seed bed. Am I really trying to manage those weeds? If I'm in an organic system where I can't spray any products, am I trying to increase that water infiltration? So again, to till or not to till, I would say tillage is just an option that farmers have available in their toolbox. Okay, here's some examples of some different planting equipment. Again, I promise you, I'm not trying to sell a specific color tractor or equipment. The purpose of this planting equipment is to place the seed into, or just kind of shallow on top of the soil surface. Based on the growing habit of individual crops, it's important that we are very precise about how deep that seed gets planted in the soil to ensure that it's going to germinate and produce roots and have the best chance for success and for survival. And so planters, like we see on the top right, can really be adjusted to really ensure that that crop is being placed, that seed is being placed at the precise depth that it needs to. I've gone out to multiple calls to growers, and we're looking in the season, in the middle of the season, they're like, why does my crop look good? And really some of the questions that we start with were, did you check your planting depth? Did you run a pass with your planter and then get out and dig up that seed and make sure it was at the right depth? It's really important. And while these machines are capable of doing whatever we want, we as humans have to make sure we're setting them to the appropriate setting. The example down here on the bottom left is a grain drill. This is typical for crops. Like some folks can use drills to plant small grains where we're not necessarily concerned about the spacing between the row, and we don't need an exact population, and that plant that seed doesn't have to go particularly shallow. So this can be another option, another piece of equipment that you may see running down the roads this time of year and in the spring as well. Okay, so we've got our crop planted. It's off to a good start.
Nicole,
we don't just, yeah, sure.
Wander too far.
Yeah.
Sorry. We do have a question about tillage. So
sure.
Two questions actually. One is, what is the efficiency of a no-till system? And then the second question, you had mentioned some soil types are prone to compaction, and what types of soils would be prone to those compaction conditions?
Sure. I'll start with the second one first. So soils that tend to be prone to compaction are soils that are going to have a little bit higher of a clay content. So we tend to refer to them as heavier soils. So when they have a higher clay content, as your heavy equipment is kind of running across the field, I like to think of it as the squish, right? You've got maybe wet fields, you're running heavy equipment, you're squeezing all of the air and the water out of that soil, and you're almost gluing your soil particles together. And without some kind of tillage, something to physically break apart that glue, that clay that's gluing that soil together, again, it's not going to be a very hospitable place for you to plant your seed in. And so we get concerned about compaction on those soils that have a higher clay content. The first question was about efficiency of no-till systems. So I guess, well, efficiency is a very broad term. I will say that a concern that I tend to have sometimes with no-till systems is making sure we're getting that good seed to soil contact. And so when we're thinking about managing our fields in a long-term no-till, we really want to make sure that we are somehow moving that residue, even if it's just slightly where we're planting, out of the way or breaking it up somehow to ensure that when we are planting our seed, it is being planted into soil and not necessarily just into residue that's on the surface. And so that tends to be one of my major concerns when we get into these like long-term no-till systems. There's also the chance, the option of what can happen we call nutrient stratification. And so if we're not doing any kind of tillage where we're mixing up the soil, as we're applying nutrients on the surface, be it manure, be it commercial fertilizer, those nutrients are concentrating in a very thin band of soil right at the surface and not necessarily moving deeper into the entire profile. So when we think about our crop roots, they occupy 6 to 8 inches of the top layer of soil. If we're just applying nutrients on the surface without mixing that soil in, we're really only putting our nutrients in maybe the top 2 inches of the soil. So our nutrients are maybe not always getting down into the roots, into that growing zone where our plant needs it. And so those are two of my major, again, concerns, things we just need to keep in mind in our no-till systems is making sure we're getting good seed to soil contact and avoiding that nutrient stratification. So hopefully I answered that question. If I didn't, let's continue it at the end of the presentation, if that's okay. Okay, I'm gonna hop back into in-season management. So we've got our crop up and going. In these two pictures here, you can see our corn on the right and our soybeans on the left, off to a pretty good start. We really need to make sure while they're little and while they're still kind of vulnerable, that we are managing our fields to give these, baby crops their best shot. And really one of the main things to do is control weeds. And so weeds are basically any plant that we don't want in that field at the time. And so, and really the point is they rob nutrients, they rob water away from our cash crop, the crop that we want to be growing. They compete with them basically. We don't need any competition. These plants are going to have a hard enough time making it through the growing season, being able to produce that grain. We don't need anything else getting in their way. And so we really want to eliminate that competition that weeds provide for nutrients and for water. And so there's a couple different options you can see on the right. This is an example of cultivation. So this corn crop has already started growing. This tractor with this implement is coming through and just doing some tillage right between the rows. All right, so just coming through, again, burying, maybe there's some weeds growing in between the rows, just burying them under the soil, preventing any weed seeds that maybe just started emerging. All right. This is common. This is really the major option that folks have in organic production systems. They're not allowed to use any type of pesticide, an herbicide or a fungicide. And so in-furrow cultivation is probably going to be the best option in organic systems. You may see something that looks like this, a self-propelled sprayer, or even kind of pull behinds, an implement that gets pulled behind the tractor. And again, that's just going to be spraying some type of pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, again, to kill any type of weeds that are competing with our cash crop, potentially kill any virus, bacteria, fungi that are infecting and harming our crop during the season. Then we make it all the way through the season. Our crop has grown up, produced grain, gone to maturity, hopefully gone past maturity, started to dry down a little bit, and then we start thinking about harvest. Everyone's getting itchy now, thinking about harvest and anxious to get out there. I stole this picture from the internet. I wanted to show, this is like, when people think about harvesting in the Midwest, this is what we think about, 5 combines running at the same time through a giant field. But anyone who lives in Maryland knows that this probably isn't the scene, and this really isn't what we see in Maryland. We'll typically see 1, maybe 2 combines running in one field at a time. But again, as Andy alluded to when we first started, our average farm size is not large enough to justify the purchase of 5 combines to be harvesting. And so this is an example of a combine, and I want to make the point that these heads can be changed out. So a farmer may purchase a combine machine and have 2 different types of heads that are used for different types of crop. And so you'll see this kind of head with the circulating fingers that is typically used for soybeans and wheat harvest. And then I have an example. See, I show all colors in my presentations. I have an example, again, same machine with a different head here. You'll notice the long snouts travel in between. This is just meant for harvesting corn. So the snouts will travel in between the rows of corn, and one row will get sucked into this machine between those snouts there. So again, same combine machine, different heads that can be interchanged depending on the crop that you're harvesting. All right, so we've grown our crop. Now we've harvested it. We've gotten rid of all the residue. All that is left in our bin inside of our combine is just our kernels of corn. They've been stripped off the cob, or our soybeans that have been pulled out of the pod, and our wheat seed, our wheat grain that has been pulled out of the head. What happens next, right? Do you often see these giant combines running down the road? I mean, at the same consistency that you see a car running down the road? Typically not. You'll see a combine moving from one field to the next. But primarily this time of year, you'll start seeing grain trucks, tractor trailers moving around. And so the grain that is harvested with the combine is unloaded into some type of a large tractor trailer like this, or a grain truck. And it is these trucks that you'll often see really running down the road, transporting that grain from the field where it was harvested to its maybe final destination. So some growers are have the land, the space, the capital to be able to put, grain bins, grain storage on their individual farm or on their individual operation. So that tractor trailer will come from the field, wherever that field may be, could be right next door, could be 3 or 4 counties over, could be the next state over. That tractor trailer will come back, unload that grain, which is then stored in these large bins for later. And we'll talk about that in a second. Start talking about money. So some of those trucks will go back to an individual farm and unload into that kind of farmer's grain storage. Some folks who do not have the ability, the capital, the space to be able to put up their grain storage simply will take that grain that gets harvested from the field. That tractor trailer will go right to a mill somewhere and we'll sell that grain immediately. And so if you're driving down the road and you see, you know, a multitude of very large grain bins in one location, chances are that doesn't belong to an individual farmer. That belongs to a mill or a company that will purchase that grain, purchase that that product that was produced directly from the farmer. So some folks will hold on to it, maybe try to sell it at a later date. Some folks who don't have that option, those trucks will go right from the field, right to the mill. All right, and this is a really good time. This is where I want to transition and talk a little bit about money, right? So everything to this point has, as I mentioned in the beginning, looked very capital intensive. There's a lot of equipment. Wow, like that's a lot of money that is being spent on the, you know, enterprise of agriculture. All right. What's important to remember about agriculture that I think some folks who aren't in agriculture don't always remember. Folks get into agriculture because there is a passion, but it is also a business and is also a livelihood. Farmers still do have to make money. All right. Unlike other small businesses, for example, maybe someone opens up a restaurant and, you know, they decide they're going to serve bagels and cheese. I'm hungry, so I'm thinking about bagels and cream cheese for breakfast. All right. Now you can price your bagel at whatever you want to price your bagel. You can sell a bagel for $2. You could sell a bagel for $12. You can really do whatever you want if you're opening your own business. People may not pay for your $12 bagel, but you can set that price where you want to. What's important to remember is that grains are commodities. They are traded on a global scale. The prices for grains are set by the global markets. Farmers, I like to say, are price takers, not price setters. They don't get to drive up to the mill with that load of corn and say, I want you to pay me, you know, $8 a bushel for that. They don't have the option. They pull up to the mill and the mill says, this is how much we will pay you today. This is what the price of corn is today. And if you don't like it, maybe you can come back tomorrow. Maybe you can come back in a week, but this is the price that we can give you. So farmers are price takers, not price setters. All right. And when we think about, well, what affects grain prices? How do the mills know, you know, what that grain should be priced at today? How does that price fluctuate over time? There are so many factors that affect the price of grain. Let's even just corn for an example. Corn can also be used to produce ethanol. So if ethanol is being used across the country, that is going to change the price of corn. What do the export markets look like? What are fuel prices like? You know, if crude oil prices are high, that's going to affect the price of corn because there's a lot of transportation involved with moving grain around. What is the strength of the US dollar in the global economy? Things that really farmers and individuals can't control, but these have an impact on what that grain price is going to be. At the end of the day, what's important when we talk about commodity prices, it all comes back to supply and demand. So all of these other factors are somehow affecting the supply and or the demand of our grains and fluctuating the prices based on. Okay, so supply and demand is the most important thing to remember when we're talking about these commodity prices. Okay, so here is a screenshot. I provided Andy, who he will provide with you provide you with a list of some resources, and I've put a link into the CME group. This is just the Chicago Board of Trade. You can go look up corn like any other commodity. There's oil, any other commodity you can think of, agriculture, the prices are right there. And so we can look at a daily snapshot of what that corn price is doing. And so I've taken a daily snapshot here. We have on the bottom of this graph here are our months. This is obviously 2020. And then on our y-axis here, this is the price. So when you see 328, you want to think about that as $3.28. So this line up here, this happened to be the day that I took this screenshot. Corn price was at $3.65. All right. And so you can see the trend as we move through the year. You know, prices are kind of going down. I think the savvy farmer who has storage on their farm to be able to hold onto that corn will hold on to that corn until winter, early spring. Most of the supply, in theory, from last year has been used up. So instead of selling it to that mill, you know, in the fall when everybody else is selling it, when supply is really high, some farmers will wait until supply starts going down, price will go up, demand will go up, and they will get a better price for that corn, all right? And so it's really interesting. I wanted to talk about an example of things that affect the corn markets. And so I want to draw your attention here to kind of mid-August. There was an extremely sharp decline in corn prices, all right? Something happened mid-August that drastically changed our corn price. This is the downfall of Zoom, that I can't randomly pick on people and force them to raise their hand to answer my questions here, all right? But something happened mid-August that drastically changed our corn price. Again, back to supply and demand, something that could have altered either supply or demand. All right, think about it for a second. Does anyone remember what happened? There was that huge storm, that derecho, out in the Midwest, August 10th. Hopefully y'all have seen the headlines somewhere. This is just a horrible picture to see. Nice green, healthy looking corn laying flat, broken off, probably will not be able to be harvested. Here's another screenshot. I was just pulling some headlines that I could find. This storm apparently went 700 miles. You could see from the satellite images the corn that was flattened, and I have an example. I have an example on the next slide to show you guys. So this, I liked this headline. You can. Let me show you the next slide. So here was a zoomed in picture of that satellite view. This was before the damage. So this kind of metropolitan area that we can see here is Des Moines, Iowa. All right. This was before the storm, and then this was after the storm. So if you can see this light colored swath here and over here, that is corn that is laying flat on its side, will not be able to be harvested. That is supply that is potentially lost to the market. So I'll flip back and forth. Before, try to move my cursor out of the way. Before and after. I could just sit here forever. Before, everything looking nice and green. After, all right? 700 miles of corn that is laying down, going through the corn belt, the Midwest part of the country where we rely on them producing corn, all right? That storm destroyed a large portion of the corn crop. That market is reacting to this potential decreased supply, okay? People panicked. We're not gonna have enough corn, okay? And so this didn't even affect us. That weather, that storm, maybe we got a little bit of rain, but that storm really had no effect on our crops, all right? But farmers are paying attention to what's happening, not just in other parts of the country, but other parts of the world, because that action that happened in the Midwest could potentially impact the price that our farmers here locally are going to get for their grain, okay? What's interesting, as we think about Maryland, as we zoom in and we think about Maryland, all right, again, we've got livestock producers and we've got folks that are producing grain. As grain prices fluctuate, you're always gonna have someone who's happy and you're always gonna have someone who's grumpy, all right? Crop farmers, those who primarily get their income from producing grain, harvesting grain, want those grain prices to be high, okay? But folks who are producing livestock that have to feed that grain to their animals, they want those grain prices to be low. That's an expensive cost for them. They want their feed costs to be low, okay? So I like to say that there's always somebody happy and there's always somebody upset as grain prices start fluctuating, all right? But farmers are considering a multitude of these economic factors when they are making management decisions on their operation. They're thinking about what's the price of oil and what's happening with my the soybean exports in Brazil. as they're making decisions of how they're going to manage their fields, either in the current growing season or even in the next season. And so something that we often have to keep in mind in extension as we are trying to encourage our producers to adopt new practices, those in government entities who are encouraging growers to adopt new practices, we really have to be laser focused on what is going to be the cost of making that management change. All right. If you're asking a farmer to do something different on their operation, how much is it going to cost you? If you've ever been at a grower meeting, you'll know that that's the first question that they will ask. Great, I see that that works, but tell me how much it's going to cost me. Okay. Besides cost, another very important factor is going to be the time commitment that that producer is going to have to invest. Okay, it's not just an investment in money, it's also an investment of time. Okay, and we may be encouraging growers to adopt a practice that costs them virtually nothing, but if it is going to mean multiple trips across the field, it's going to be a headache, they're going to have to invest a lot of their own time into that practice, especially something that's going to be multiple year, meaning every year they're going to have to come back and do something different for this process. It's going to be a hard sell, okay? Because time and money are extremely important and are decision-making factors that our growers are going to use. And so when we're thinking about an extension and government entities encouraging growers to adopt new practices, that new practice or that change must be low cost and must mean a minimal time investment from that grower themselves. So I'm going to talk about the perfect example of just what we're talking about, encouraging growers to adopt new practices, and really talk about a successful way that this was implemented. And that's cover crops. Andy talked about this in the beginning with his introduction. Again, he set me up perfectly. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Maryland cover crop program. So when we're talking about a cover crop, we mean a crop that is on the field, that is growing in the field, but it's not necessarily a cash crop. We're not planning on harvesting it at the end of the year. We grow corn because we're planning on harvesting it and selling that grain. But we grow a cover crop strictly for the environmental benefits that we are going to gain from that practices. The plan is not that we're going to harvest this crop at the end of the season. The goal is to protect our soil and keep our nutrients in place, not necessarily to harvest that crop. So when we have crops growing during the growing season, we are feeding them fertilizer, but they are also using them. So we've got a fairly low risk for losing nutrients during the growing season where we have a crop that is actively growing and actively using those nutrients. As we move into that winter season, we here in Maryland get a lot more rain, get a lot more precipitation. We maybe don't have, if you're not growing wheat, you don't have something growing in the field. If you don't have any cover, you've got that bare soil that's exposed and there's an increased risk for erosion and runoff like we talked about earlier with tillage. So winter really is a very risky time for us in terms of potential for nutrient loss to our surface waters, our ditches, and our streams. All right, and so the idea of using this cover crop is after our harvest of our cash crop in the fall, we plant this cover crop and it's just going to live throughout the spring or throughout the winter, and we are going to kill it in the spring. Okay, that early growth in the fall, kind of right after corn, soybean harvest, that early growth is really going to scavenge any nutrients that are left over that for some reason our crop didn't use. All right, so our corn, our soybean crop, if it didn't use it, if it was left over, the early growth of that cover crop is going to suck up those nutrients. It's going to be held there in the plant. All right, that plant is going to grow throughout the winter in these images that you can see here, hold those nutrients in place and hold that soil in place. All right, and then in the spring, if we spray or we till and we terminate that cover crop, we're leaving those nutrients in the field. It's getting recycled back into the soil. So instead of a cash crop where we harvest those nutrients, we take them away from the field, a cover crop just recycles those nutrients, basically just holding on to them, holding them in place over the winter, but then they can be available for our cash crop in future growing seasons. All right. Really a perfect idea and a really great conservation tool. All right. So how did we get folks to do this, right? Andy said we are leading the way nationally in the country for cover crops. How did we convince people to do this? That sounds like time and that sounds like a financial investment, right? Well, the Maryland Department of Agriculture, who administers the cover crop program, they actually provide funding to farmers to cover the cost of seed, labor, equipment that is associated, those costs that are associated with planting, and then terminating those cover crops, all right? So taking care of that financial burden, all right? Farmers can receive up to $90 an acre just by managing those cover crops differently to optimize that nutrient uptake, holding on to those nutrients, all right? Planting early in the fall, leaving that plant growing as long as possible in the spring, waiting as long as possible to kill it off, selecting specific cover crop species that are really going to suck up and utilize those leftover nutrients. And the perfect example of minimizing the time commitment of farmers is utilizing aerial application to apply that cover crop seed into a standing crop, all right? Aerial application, you guys have probably seen some of this happening. Well, depending on where you live. I know over here on the Eastern Shore, our aerial applicators have been busy, all right? And this time of year, that is exactly what they're doing. They are planting cover crop. They are seeding. All they are spitting out is cover crop seed onto fields where a crop is still growing, all right? So aerial application, you can use a fixed wing plane or even a helicopter. I know out in Western Maryland, they use helicopters. This can be used for the application of different types of products, cover crop seed, to our crops during the growing season. When our corn gets so tall that we can't run a tractor over it, or when the canopy of our soybeans has filled in and we really don't want to run any equipment through that standing crop, we can utilize aerial application as an option for putting down some of these products. And again, minimizing that compaction. We are eliminating one more trip with that heavy equipment across the field and hopefully minimizing that compaction to our soil, all right? So these aerial applicators can apply different types of pesticides during the growing season. Right now, if you're seeing some type of aerial application happening, they're likely planting cover crop seeds, getting that cover crop out there into that plant while that cash crop is still standing, hasn't been harvested yet. And so this allows those farmers to plant their cover crops earlier, and it eliminates not just the financial, but it eliminates that time commitment from that grower. They're not even have to worry about planting their cover crop. It's being done by someone else for them. All right. So wrapping up here, I think we've made the point that Maryland agriculture is very diverse. We've got animal, livestock, and grain production happening locally. Here in Maryland, we are really focusing on management decisions that are balancing efficient nutrient utilization by the crop and really helping to maximize that profit based on our commodity pricing. This is all the thoughts that are going through our farmers' head throughout the year. Preparing the soil, growing and harvesting your crops requires specialized equipment that hopefully you all feel a little more comfortable identifying now. Global economics and global factors really drive the local management decisions that are happening on farms, all right? In addition to the concern by all farmers in the state of Maryland for protecting our sensitive environment. Everyone loves the Chesapeake Bay, and all farmers want to make the best decision to protect the environment, all right? As we are encouraging folks to adopt novel practices, we really have to make sure that we're focusing on practices that are going to be low cost or subsidized and are not going to mean a major time commitment for farmers. And that's going to be a recipe for successfully adopting and implementing new management practices. So with that, here is my contact information. Email is probably the best right now as we're all still kind of teleworking. You'll get a copy of these slides. Andy and Erica will provide that to you. I think I have gone slightly over time, but Andy, if there's time and you'd like me to take some questions, I'm happy to do so.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. We do have one question in the chat you could answer, and then we'll do our 10-minute break and reconvene at 10:30. But the question is, how come farmers don't organize to impose their prices?
Well, I don't know that they particularly could. I think it really, when we are talking about something like grain prices, it's a commodity like something like fuel prices. So, you drive by the gas station and one day the price of fuel is at one price, and then 2 days later it's at a different price. It's not necessarily the gas station operator who's setting that price. That's what they paid for that last load of fuel, and they have to adjust their prices just the same way. And so the best option for farmers is to, if they have the space and if they have the capital allowed, is to put in some type of grain storage, and then they can really follow the markets. They can hold on to that grain for 6 8 months if they want to, and watch the markets and see as prices go up, and then start to deliver and sell that product, sell their grain when those prices go up. But I don't know that any kind of local band or local organization is really going to be able to shift the global markets in the way that I think farmers would hope. And so that's why when we think about farmers, they are price takers, not price setters. They don't have the luxury of saying, this is how much I think my grain is worth. So, and I'm tap dancing into area that is not my focus. I will admit that economics is not really my background, and so we're pushing on the limits of my knowledge here in terms of economics. But if you have additional economics questions, I'm happy to connect folks with the right people who would have the answers to those questions. So hopefully that helped a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. If anybody else has any other questions that you think of, just type them in the chat and we'll get to those towards the end of the day today, where we have some time built in for some extra questions and discussion. So with that, I'll let everybody take a quick break until 10:30. We'll reconvene with our next presentation by Dr. Rev.
Have you talked to Amanda?
All right, folks. So I have 10:30, so we will get started again. So up next, we do have Dr. Amanda Grev, who is our forage specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. And over the next hour, she's going to discuss forage production in the state of Maryland. So Amanda, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Sounds good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I think I will do the same as Nicole, and I just wanted to pop on the video here quick to say hello so you all can see what I look like, I guess, for those of us who haven't met. And as Andy said, today we are going to be talking about forage production in Maryland. Okay. So just a kind of wanted to start off with a brief outline of the things that we're going to cover today. You'll see a common theme throughout this presentation is that forages are very diverse, and there are a lot of different types of forages, and they can be used in a lot of different types of ways. So I tried to do kind of a overarching snapshot of forage production and the concepts behind that. So we'll talk a little bit about Maryland specifically, the importance of forages and why they're used, some of the different types of forages and the management practices associated with that, some of the key concepts associated with forage production, and then a little bit on some of the common forages that we have here in Maryland. So just to start off, when we think about forage production, obviously forage encompasses more than just hay, but hay is one of the things that you'll find most frequently reported because it is usually produced as a dollar value. It has a dollar value that can be used for selling it. So just wanted to show you this chart showing the hay production and the value of hay from the last, roughly decade or so, not quite up to, this year or last year, but you can see that, there are thousands of tons of hay produced within the state of Maryland, and this has, thousands of dollars worth of value. And this hay is used, as we'll talk about, within several different livestock industries, as well as our other forages. So as of 2018, the hay production in the state of Maryland, or forage production, was around 195,000 or 200,000 acres, and a little over 550,000 tons. So Maryland does produce a lot of forage, especially for its small size. So when we think about forage, what exactly is forage anyways? Forage, oftentimes we think of the first thing that comes to mind, nice, green, lush pasture, but forage actually comes in many other ways as well. So of course we can have things like hay. You may be, driving down the road and see, round bales or square bales of hay out in the fields that have been harvested. Forage can also come in the form of baleage, which we'll talk about some of the differences between hay and baleage. And then also as silage, which is usually a little bit less frequently thought of as a form of forage, but it is one of the forms of forage, and we will talk a little bit about silage as well. So as you can see, forage comes in many different forms, but basically it's really, any plant that is eaten by livestock could be considered a forage source. So why do we need these forage sources? Well, they provide the major feed source for pretty much all types of livestock. We have the beef industry, the dairy industry, which predominantly relies on things like corn silage. The equine industry uses a lot of hay and pasture to support those equine rations. The sheep and goat industries also rely on forage as the base for their diets. And then to a much lesser extent, there is some interest in pasture-raised swine or poultry production. So really, when we think about this, forages can make or encompass, anywhere from 60 to 95 or even, 99% of a livestock animal's diet, depending, of course, on the species and the life stage and the production, etc. But it makes up a huge component of the diet for these different livestock species. Forages also are oftentimes used for conservation efforts or as cover crops, which you heard Nicole talk about in her presentation. They have many beneficial qualities when used in this manner, things like reducing soil erosion and compaction, mitigating nutrient leaching that may be happening. So there are a lot of different ways that we can use forages in these manners. So we're going to go through kind of the different types of forage, starting with pasture. We know that pasture is basically forages that are grazed, or if you want to call it harvested, by our livestock species. And this is common in the beef, dairy, equine, sheep, and goat industries. So used a little bit within each of the livestock industries. I did want to mention a little bit related to pasture and pasture production, in that, pasture is oftentimes thought of as, oh, you have this big field, it has grass growing in it, you just throw your animals out there, and, that's all there really is to it. When in reality, there's actually a lot more to it than that. So the photo that you see on the left-hand side of the screen would be, a condition under what we would call a poorly managed pasture, where, you don't see a lot of grass growing, things have been really overgrazed, that field is not being very well managed, versus the field on the right side, obviously we have a lot more forage production coming from that field, a lot better quality forage for those sheep to consume. So really, when we think about pasture, we do want to think about it as a crop that we need to manage and work with and utilize in order to reach its full potential. So we want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about pasture. We know that good pasture requires good management. So what might that look like? Well, as I kind of alluded to, the basis of, or the traditional style of pasture management would be more of what we would call kind of a continuous grazing situation, which is where, we put those animals out into a field, and we just kind of let them, do what they will with what's out there. We don't really manage it. We just kind of let them have access to the entire field. If we kind of move into more of a pasture managed setting, then we think of something like, okay, let's subdivide that field maybe into a few different sections. We can keep the livestock in one area at a time and move them through those different areas of the field. This can be done, in a simple rotation, maybe moving those animals once a week from section to section. This can be made, as intensive as you want it to be. You can further subdivide those paddocks and move those animals every day, or twice a day even, to really get to really capitalize on what's there in that field. So the management options really range from simple to intensive. And when producers are thinking about how they want to manage their pastures, it depends on a lot of different things. Things like what type of livestock species they have. Are they full-time farming, or are they doing this part-time and they have day job? Are they needing the stage of the livestock species? Do those livestock need the best quality that you can provide, or are they kind of just your pasture pony, easy keeper, horse that might not need as much? So there's a lot that goes into it. Some of the advantages and disadvantages that can come from using pasture as a forage source. Advantages would be, like I said, the livestock are basically harvesting the forage themselves. So that kind of saves you the effort of, going in and making hay and cutting hay and baling hay and all those extra steps. Another advantage is that those livestock are out in that field, so they are helping to spread their manure or the nutrients that are in that manure back across the fields, in a way of kind of re-fertilizing those fields by the livestock being in them. We'll talk a little bit about the harvest process and the losses that are associated with that. So in a pasture setting, you don't have losses from harvest. And then we have, less of an equipment requirement. We don't need those mowers, those balers, all those extra things that we'll talk about when we get to kind of more of the harvested forages. From a disadvantages side, we know that forage growth and quality fluctuates a lot throughout the year. So pastures are really productive in the spring. We have a lot of growth, a lot of forage available for those animals to eat. Then they go through something called, that summer slump, where they're a little bit less productive. We might, be starting to run out of forage, or the forage that we have is a little bit lower quality. Then also in the wintertime, we don't have pasture that's growing. So there are times of the year when our pasture is not going to be able to provide the forages that we need. We talked a little bit about management. We know that livestock can ruin a pasture if it's not managed well. And then, of course, the pasture does require infrastructure in the form of fencing and waters, providing mineral or feeding options, housing, shelter, etc. So all that has to be kind of considered when you're thinking about this system. So for each of the types of forage that we talk about today, I'm going to talk just briefly on the keys for, good pasture or good hay or good silage, just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that producers are considering or dealing with as they're, going through these different forage systems. So keys for good pasture, of course, this is the foundation of all forage production and all crop production. You heard Nicole talk about soil fertility and weed control. That's just as true from a pasture or a forage production standpoint as it is from a cropping standpoint. Allowing for adequate rest. We kind of talked a little bit about overgrazing. You saw that picture where the sheep had grazed things, down to the dirt. That's the type of situation that we want to avoid. So, here's kind of a good visual where, forage plants were cut down to a 2-inch height, either every week, which is on the left, every 2 weeks in the middle, or every 4 weeks, which is on the right-hand side. And you can see the difference in the production of that forage based on those different rest periods. So that's where some of those grazing management practices really come into play. We really want to give those forages that time that they need to rest and replenish their carbohydrate reserves and regrow to their fullest potential. On a similar note, while we want to provide rest, we also want to avoid overgrazing. And this, a common term in the forage industry is leaving an appropriate residual, or the amount of forage residual. And basically what this means is how much forage is left in that field after you have, grazed it or harvested it, or cut that field. So leaving an appropriate residual, you can graze it down to the dirt, which would be no residual. You can leave, 2 inches of, stem left in that field. You can leave 4 inches of stem, you can leave the entire plant. And, they've done studies over the years that have looked at, leaving different amounts of forage material. And they've shown that not only does this affect what is happening above the soil surface, but it's also affecting what happens below the soil surface. So you can see on this scale, an ungrazed plant with those thick, really dense roots, if we, take roughly 50% of that forage material off of that plant, or, harvest or graze that plant halfway down, we really still kind of maintain that dense root system. When we start, consuming or grazing or cutting, 80% or more of that forage, that's when you really start to see those negative effects on not only what's happening above that soil surface, but the root health that's happening below the surface as well. So really, the summary of all of those can be accomplished in a pasture setting by using rotational grazing. Producers should be rotating their animals to different fields, not overgrazing them, leaving that appropriate residual in order to ensure a good, healthy pasture in the long run. So we kind of touched on, there are times of the year when our pasture is not producing, whether that's in the winter, the heat of the summer. So there are times of the year that we will need to use harvested forages, even if we're relying mostly on a pasture-based system. Those times of the year when we would need harvested forages would be situations where we might not have enough pasture, whether that means we have more animals than our land base can support, or whether that means it's been a drought year and maybe pasture isn't growing very quickly, so we kind of eat up everything that's there and we kind of run out of pasture. Pasture is not available, of course, winter, heat of the summer. Harvested forages can also be used at times when we want to either rest the pasture, when we're using that rotational grazing or proper management, or under circumstances where we might be needing to renovate some pastures. Pasture renovation doesn't necessarily happen every year, but it does periodically happen. So there may be times when we need to take those animals off that pasture so we can do some renovation, some reseeding, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there are times when livestock are confined, whether this is, in a stall, in a trailer, going someplace, in a paddock. There are times when we need to have them off of those fields. So these are all times when we really need to use harvested forages. So we're going to go through kind of 3 main types of harvested forages, starting with hay. For each of these harvested forages, we know that they are harvested using equipment and then stored for later use. For hay in particular, this is basically the drying of forage to preserve it. So that we'll talk about the steps in the haymaking process in a minute. But basically hay is dried forage. It's been cut and dried and saved to use, during those times of the year that we need it. Hay is often used in the beef, equine, sheep, and goat industries. It's a little bit less common in the dairy industry, but still can be used sometimes. And then, of course, as we said, hay is used when those animals are confined or under periods where there is no pasture. So there are different types of hay that can be produced, both in size and shape. They kind of come in, small packages, which are usually referred to as small square bales. Contrary to what the name suggests, these are actually more rectangular than a true square. But these small square bales basically are a little bit more labor intensive, because they're smaller, so there's a lot more of them. So, they require a little bit more handling to move them around. But they're fairly easy to handle. The most common weight for a small square bill would be somewhere around the 50 pounds. So easy enough for, a person to pick up that hay bale and move it around. They're smaller, so they fit into different size spaces, so they can be a little bit easier from a storage standpoint. They're typically a little bit more expensive on, say $1 per ton basis. It's, kind of similar to, buying groceries. When you buy things in small packages, usually you pay a little bit more for that smaller package versus when you buy things in large packages or in bulk, usually they're a little bit less expensive in that form. So small square bills are more common usually on smaller farms. They have less animals. They don't need quite as much hay. So the small square bills are kind of easy to fit into that type of situation. The larger types of hay, usually would be kind of in the like 800 to 1,000 pound range. And these can come as square or round bales. You can see pictures of each of those on the bottom right side of the screen. These, because they're bigger, they're a little bit less labor intensive. You can fit more in one package. They're easy to handle, assuming you have, a tractor or some sort of equipment that can pick those up and move them around. Obviously, you're not going to be able to really move them by yourself without the appropriate equipment. And then, as I said, they're usually a little bit less expensive, kind of on $1 per ton basis. So how does the hay making process work? For those that aren't familiar with forage harvesting, as Nicole alluded to, there's a lot of different types of equipment that are required, a lot of different procedures and processes that go on throughout those different steps. So we're going to just kind of briefly go over the steps in some of these different harvested forage production systems. So starting with hay, as we said, it's the field curing or the drying. Curing is basically that hay is laying in the field, drying. So the first step, of course, is to cut that field. So, this requires some type of mower. There are several different types, but you can see one of the ones that you might see in that photo. So forage is cut, at a given standpoint. We'll talk a little bit about, when to cut or the right time for that in a little while, but that's the first step of the harvest process. After it's cut, that's where the drying comes in. So you might see, forages kind of lying in those really wide, they call them swaths or rows, laying in the field. Those are cut forages that are in that field and laying there to dry. The next step is to rake those swaths into what they call a windrow. So you can see in that image, if you look right here, you can see this is a row that has not yet been raked. So that row still has that cut forage kind of laying on top of that field. And right here behind the tractor and that rake, you can see the forage that has been raked into that windrow. And the reason that we need to rake it is basically to make it into a nice little line so that we can bale it. So the final step would be the baler. These balers, of course, come in many, many different sizes and shapes, depending on, the size of the hay bale and other factors. But the one that you see there is for a round bale. So that tractor is basically collecting that hay that's cut in that windrow and baling it into a hay bale. So I did want to mention that with harvested forages, we can have an accumulation of losses. All of these different steps that happen have some sort of forage loss associated with them. So as soon as that forage is cut, we can start to accumulate losses. And this is where some of those management practices really play a really big role. These losses accumulate with each subsequent step. So while that forage is laying in that field curing, you can have as little as 3% or up to 25% dry matter loss. This is also a little bit I'm blanking on the word, a little bit affected by weather. If that forage is laying in that field to dry and it's supposed to be a nice sunny day and, a stray thunderstorm comes through and rains on that forage, that's going to set back that drying process and really make it more difficult to get that hay dry. It's going to, wash some of those nutrients out of that forage. So the losses are very variable and it depends on management and then also weather conditions. As we're harvesting that hay, we're using all this equipment to rake those different piles, and that hay at that point is fairly dry and a little bit brittle. So you might notice things like this, like this little cloud of like dust that's kind of coming out behind the either the baler or the hay rake. Some of that is dust, but some of it is also actually leaf material that it has dried and kind of become brittle, so it can shatter a little bit. So we can have some forage losses during that harvesting process. Storage is a big one. Depending on how we store our hay, you can lose huge amounts of hay from storage alone. Obviously, there are some best management practices when it comes to hay storage. We don't want to be leaving our bales out in a weedy field for years and years, like what you see in the photo on the right there. So with good storage practices, we can really minimize those storage losses. And then finally, feeding. And we're not going to talk a lot about feeding today, but depending on the method that you use for feeding that hay to your livestock, you can also have losses during the feeding process. So there's a lot of steps in there and a lot of potential for losses. So again, that's why management plays a really big role in this system. So when it comes to hay, again, we have advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages are, once that hay is harvested, the amount that you have and the quality that you have in that hay is relatively steady. It's not like pasture where it's so dependent on those different growing conditions. You know how much hay that you cut, how much hay you put in that barn. You can do a forage test, which we'll talk about, and get a quality analysis on that hay, and kind of exactly what you're feeding to those animals. It's also a more consistent supply throughout the year. You don't have to deal with those different fluctuations with pasture, growing or not growing as quickly. And it can be stored and kept, for long periods of time, assuming that we're using those good storage practices. Some of the disadvantages associated with hay are it requires a relatively long window for drying. So, I mentioned, that forage has to lay in that field and dry down, so lose the moisture content in that hay. And this is really weather dependent. If it's really humid out, hay is not going to dry as fast. If it's rainy, obviously, hay is not going to, dry at all. So what you really want is kind of those like nice sunny, dry days with a light breeze to make the most of your drying time. So that can be a really big challenge from a production standpoint. When we have months that are really rainy and wet and we don't have, any good 3 or 4 day periods where producers can get their hay dry, that can be a huge challenge for them in the production system. We have losses that occur during the harvesting process, as we've already talked about. Hay also, removes a lot of nutrients from that field. When you cut that forage and take it off of that field, you're taking a lot of nutrients away from that field. And, usually this is fed elsewhere, in a barn or, some sort of confinement setting. So really, in order to ensure the continuation of that stand and to have that stand continue to be productive moving forward, oftentimes it requires a little bit more nutrients to be added back. This can be in the form of manure that's spreaded on the field, fertilizer. There are options for that, but that's one thing that is a consideration for hay production. And then of course it requires a little bit more equipment. You need the mower and the baler and the rake and all those different pieces of equipment that are essential for this production process. So some of the keys for good hay production are to cut at the right time. This is really based on forage maturity, which we'll talk about in a little while. It requires that window of time for drying. Again, this is really weather dependent, but just a rough estimate, somewhere in the kind of 2 to 4 day range to get that hay nice and dry. You want to get that hay down to a proper moisture. This is really important for hay because if it's too wet, that's when you run the risk of heat damage. That's when there's risk of fire. You've heard or seen of barn fires or hay fires going up. Oftentimes this can be a result of hay being baled when it's too wet. If it's too wet, there can also be mold formation that starts to occur as that hay is stored in that barn or that storage facility. And here's just kind of a little bit of a visual to illustrate that. You can see along the x-axis, the number of days, and along the y-axis, the temperature. This is the temperature inside a bale of hay. So when that hay is cut at a lower moisture, kind of in that desirable range, 15 to 20%, the temperature stays lower and doesn't spike like it does if that hay is baled too wet. And that's, those higher moistures, that high temperature, that's when you get the risk of, heat damage, fire, and all of those things. So moisture is a really key principle for when it comes to making hay. All right, so the next type of harvested forage is baleage. This is somewhat similar to hay, but there is kind of an extra step in there. So again, this is a harvested forage, so it requires equipment. It's, stored for later use. There is an initial drying period, so you start the process the same as you would for dry hay. We'll talk, we'll look at the steps in a minute, but then the process is ended a little bit differently. Basically, rather than getting that hay totally dry, so it's stable, as a dry forage, we're preserving it by fermenting it. So this is where you might see those bales in the sides of the fields that have that white plastic wrap around them. This is basically to allow that bale to go through an anaerobic fermentation process, which we'll talk about in a second, that allows that bale to be preserved. Right now, this is most commonly used in the beef industry. There are other, livestock species that can utilize baleage, but it's most prevalent for beef livestock. And again, it can be used when those animals are confined or when we have no pasture availability. So we're not going to get a lot into the fermentation process because it can get kind of complicated, and I feel like it's probably more than what you might want to know. But basically, we're baling that crop, the same as we would a dry hay bale, but we're doing it at a higher moisture content. So we're not getting it quite as dry as we would for dry hay. And then instead of just baling it and leaving it, we're wrapping it in that plastic wrap, which allows it to undergo anaerobic fermentation. Basically what this means is we're excluding oxygen. We're sealing that bale so no air can get in or out. And this means that the bacteria that's in there on those plants basically converts the sugar and the carbohydrates that's in those plants to an organic acid, which lowers the pH and then preserves the forage. So the anaerobic conditions are the essential component in this. When you're doing baleage and also silage, which we'll talk about in a minute, that anaerobic or no oxygen environment is what's key to being able to preserve that forage, even though it was baled at a wetter moisture and it wasn't as dry. So you can preserve it without spoiling as long as you have that anaerobic condition. So the steps for the baleage process, again, it starts off the same as the hay production process. We have that forage is cut at an ideal stage of maturity. We start the drying process the same. We just don't let it dry quite as long. So we're raking it and baling it when it's still a little bit wetter than it would be for dry hay. And then the final step would be to add in the wrapping step into that process. And we'll talk about the different kinds of wrappers and what that entails in a minute. So we have things that are called an individual wrapper. This would be like what you see in the top photo. So it does one bale at a time. You wrap one bale together by itself. And this is, a little bit more expensive because obviously it takes a little bit more plastic to go around that bale. And it's a little bit slower because it needs more wraps to get around all those different sides. So you do use a little bit more plastic. But when you're actually going to feed that bale, if you only need one bale at a time, there it is in, the single individual package of the size that you need. So you can have less losses at feeding if you only need that small amount. Then they have something called an inline wrapper, which is what you see in the photo on the bottom. This is basically usually a little bit more expensive, but it's a lot faster. So, those bales are basically butted end to end to end and then wrapped all together like a giant tube. So because you don't need to wrap that plastic around each of those individual ends, you can go through it a little bit faster and you use a little bit less plastic in the process. But then, like I mentioned, you do need to kind of use it or feed it faster so that it's not spoiling as you're opening that packaging. So some of the advantages and disadvantages for baleage. The biggest advantage for baleage over hay is it requires less time in that field drying. So, like I mentioned, weather can be a huge challenge in hay production. It can be hard to find windows of time with good weather when producers have time to get in the field and get that hay dry. So baleage requires much less drying, and so it's a shorter time period, so that can be accomplished much faster. Usually because it's a little bit wetter, a little bit higher moisture, we have less of those harvest losses, the leaf shatter, it's not as dry, quite as brittle. So usually we have a little bit lower losses from a harvest standpoint. And then, the rest of the advantages are similar to hay. It's a harvested forage, so, your yield and your quality are set once that forage is harvested and wrapped and stored. It's a consistent supply that you can use throughout the year, and it can be stored for moderate periods of time before it goes bad or needs to be used. The disadvantages of baleage are, you still can have some losses happening during that harvest process. You're still cutting and raking and baling that hay or that baleage. It does, similar to hay, remove those nutrients from the field. So we have to consider that we need to add those back somehow. There is extra equipment that's required. That having that wrapper is kind of one extra step. There's the cost of, the wrapper itself. There's the cost of the plastic that's needed to wrap those bales. Because it's an extra step, that's a little bit of extra labor. And you also need to maintain the integrity of that plastic. In order to keep that forage preserved, you can't, have, rodents chewing holes in the plastic or holes poked in the sides, like that will cause the bales to spoil. So you really need to be careful of that. And then, what do you do with the plastic after? You have to figure out a way to dispose of that so that you can get rid of that extra plastic. So when it comes to making baleage, some of the keys for good baleage from a production standpoint, again, with any harvested forage, cut at the right time. It requires still requires some time for drying, but a much smaller window. Baling at the proper moisture for baleage, that's somewhere in the 50 to 65% moisture. So kind of halfway dry is kind of a rough way to think about it. If it's too wet, there's potential for spoilage. If it's too dry, you're not going to get the fermentation that you need to preserve that bale properly. The other important thing is that you need to wrap it soon after baling, ideally within 4 or 5 hours, but really within 12 hours is kind of the limit, because you need to get that oxygen sealed out of that bale and have that fermentation process happen in order to properly preserve that forage. And then again, you have to maintain that integrity of that plastic moving forward. All right, so the final type of forage production system that we're gonna go over is silage. And this is basically, again, harvested with equipment and stored for later use. This is, kind of the next step beyond baleage. So it's even harvested at a little bit higher moisture than what we saw for the baleage, but the concept is similar. Again, it's using preservation via that anaerobic fermentation. Silage is most commonly used within the dairy industry. The most common forages that we use to make silage would, corn is the big one. Other ones that are used for silage production are things like sorghum, alfalfa, small grains. With the exception of alfalfa, which can be harvested multiple times throughout the year, the rest of those are really only harvested once and then used year-round. So this is a little bit different from a hay production or a baleage production, where you can go in and harvest those forages, multiple times. You harvest it, the grasses grow back, you can harvest it again, the grasses grow back. You can do that a couple times throughout the growing season. With silage, again, other than alfalfa, there's really only one silage that happens during the year. So you have to store up enough to be able to use that for the rest of the year. So the steps in the silage process, it starts with chopping. So, the picture you see there is the production of corn silage. That machine is basically a chopper. So it's chopping the entire corn stalk, leaves, stalk, ears, everything that's there into little pieces and putting it into a delivery truck our transport vehicle. That silage is then moved to wherever the silage is going to be stored. There's multiple different ways you can store silage. You can use bunkers, you can use bags, you can use silos. But the key thing with that is it needs to be packed. So you'll oftentimes see, those big heavy tractors driving on the silage to kind of pack it down in tightly. You'll see the bags kind of filled to the brim and packed in there really tightly. And this is basically because you're trying to eliminate that oxygen, so to allow for that fermentation. So the more densely you can pack it, the tighter that you can pack it, the more you can squeeze that air or that oxygen out of there, and the better the fermentation will be on that product. And then, of course, in order to fully exclude the oxygen, once you're finished, packing and delivering it all, you have to seal it up really well. So you use, plastic and weigh it down with, usually tires or, other sort of weights to weigh that plastic down and keep it sealed. Same kind of concept as the baleage. You want to keep that oxygen out, keep that environment constant so that it can be stored for longer periods of time. So the advantages and disadvantages of the silage process, it's usually done at a little bit higher capacity. So, there's only kind of usually that one harvest per year. So there's a lot that comes in at one time. You have a lot of potential for storage in those big bunks or bags. It's relatively easy to mix in rations. So, you'll talk about, the livestock industry a little bit more tomorrow, but a lot of dairy cattle rations are a mix of different things. So silage is usually one of those components that's kind of mixed in. There's not really a need for a drying period because you're harvesting it at kind of the optimum moisture. So you don't have to kind of, let that corn silage lay in that field to dry at all. You go straight from harvesting it to storing it. So it's a little bit less dependent on weather from that standpoint. Again, it's a harvested forage. So once it's harvested and in that storage facility, assuming, you've done the steps properly, the yield and the quality are set for the year and you have that consistent supply to use throughout the seasons. And then like baleage, it can be stored kind of for moderate to long periods of time, assuming you're following those proper storage practices. Some of the disadvantages, again, just like our other harvested forages, there's always going to be a little bit of losses. You are removing nutrients from the field, same as you are with the other harvested forage crops. It does require that extra equipment, a chopper, way to transport that silage, place to store it. The cost of those, storage facilities and the plastic and the tires or whatever you're going to use to weigh it down. There is a relatively small moisture window, so there's really kind of an ideal window of time to cut and store that forage in, and it's a pretty small window. So it can be kind of a stressful period during that time of the year when things are ready for harvest, because you want to get it harvested and stored as quickly as you can to maintain that good quality in that ideal window. So this means there is some added labor usually during the harvest season as you're trying to get all of that done as quickly as possible. There's a lot of different steps, and it's a little bit different than, some of our kind of more traditional like haymaking process. So there can be potential, of course, for operator error, not packing it very tightly, not sealing it very well, those kinds of things. Again, the plastic integrity needs to be maintained, and then there is a need for disposal of that plastic after you've used the finished product. So some of the keys for good silage, again, you've noticed a common theme with all of our harvested crops. It really depends on the moisture content of that forage. If it's too wet, you're going to have poor fermentation. There could be some seepage coming out of the bottom of that bunk or that silo. If it's too dry, it's a little bit harder to pack it. So you can have like trapped air pockets that happen in there that can lead to spoilage. So really the important things are to pack it tightly, make sure it's densely stored in there, seal it quickly and properly, cover it well, make sure it's weighed down. And if there's no air intrusion, it really can remain stable for, long periods of time, really until the next year's, crop. And then, of course, maintain the integrity of that plastic to keep that forage stable. So that's kind of an overview of some of the basics behind, the production end of things. We've talked a lot about, different yields, different quality, cutting at different maturity. These are all kind of some of the broad overarching concepts behind forage production. So I thought I would kind of briefly go over some of these concepts that apply to kind of all of our production practices. So, hay and pasture and, baleage, etc. The first one is yield. Of course, yield is the amount of the forage that's produced. In the forage industry, this can be reported in kind of two different ways. There can be yield at a given harvest. So, you may hear like first cutting hay, second cutting hay, etc. Or it can be reported on an annual basis. So, the amount of tonnage or pounds per acre that were produced per year versus per harvest. So if you're talking yields, make sure you know if it's from one given harvest or on an annual basis. This is, most commonly in Maryland reported as tons per acre or pounds per acre. And then the other important thing to consider is we usually report yields on a dry matter basis. So, we've talked a lot about moisture today. The moisture content of the forage is basically the opposite of the dry matter content. So dry matter is the percent of the forage that is not water, so the non-moisture portion. So in pasture, those are usually, they have a lot more water. We haven't gone through that drying process. So there's a large water component to a pasture forage. So there's usually a higher moisture concentration and a lower dry matter. DM is dry matter concentration. Forages or pasture, grasses are usually somewhere around maybe 80% moisture or 20% dry matter. So hay is kind of the opposite. You saw the steps as we go through that production process. We've dried that hay down. So hay is usually kind of in that 85 to 90% dry matter, or only 10 to 15% moisture. And the reason that we report yield and quality and other things on a dry matter basis is because this allows for a comparison. It's kind of like if you think about a grape versus a raisin. Pasture would be like the grape. There's a lot of moisture in that fruit, in that grape, versus hay would be more like the raisin. We haven't changed it other than drying it down and eliminating some of that moisture. The nutrients are still there, most of them, so it's just kind of the size or the yield. But if we try to compare, the size of those, that water is going to make that grape look a lot bigger than that raisin. So in order to compare these equally on a yield basis and also on a quality basis, we want to kind of eliminate the dilution effect of that water and compare it on a 100% dry matter basis. So, we'll just do a simple conversion to convert it to 100% dry matter and then compare it that way. So when it comes to yield, like I mentioned, many of our common forages, these are all, we'll talk about different species in a minute, but these are some of our common grasses and legume cool season forages that are grown in our area. You can see that kind of growth curve that I was talking about, how there's a lot of growth happening in the spring and early summer, and they go through that kind of traditional summer slump, and there's more growth in the fall, this time of year when things are cool and wet again, and kind of optimum conditions for those forages. So when we look at the yield of those types of forages compared to some of our other forage crops, we can kind of see differences in when that forage is produced. For example, things like small grains or annual ryegrass that are kind of an annual forage, their forage production happens a little bit earlier in the year. They can grow a little bit later in the year. So we can kind of, spread that forage production out a little bit better throughout the year. On the flip side of things, we have warm season forages, which we'll talk about in a minute. Their growth occurs predominantly during that kind of hotter, drier, warmer time of the year. So, we have perennial warm season forages, which we'll show some examples of in a second. We have some annual warm season forages. Corn would be an example of an annual warm season forage. So really we have a lot of that growth occurring during those warm summer months. When it comes to forage quality, we you can think about it kind of the same as, you think about nutrition or quality of your, food that you consume. You can do an analysis. It contains a whole bunch of different things that we don't really have time to go through today. This list that you see is just a portion of all of the different nutrient analysis results that you get back from the lab if you send a forage sample off to the lab. But basically it includes things like protein, the amount of protein that's in that forage, the fiber component, how fibrous is that forage. There are, readily dissolvable carbohydrates, easily digested carbohydrates, things like simple carbohydrates, starches, sugars, those kinds of things that provide kind of a quick energy, so you'll get a measure of that. Some of the essential vitamins and minerals like calcium, phosphorus. And then the lab has also, they've done a lot of work in the forage industry developing ways to calculate or predict, how many digestible nutrients that forage can produce, what's the net energy that an animal is able to get from that forage if they consume it, what's the overall feed value of that forage. There's a lot of different components that go into these different quality parameters. That's kind of a whole nother lecture in itself, but I just wanted you to be aware that there is, forage testing and nutritive analyses that we can do to kind of figure out the quality of our different forages. And we can do this for all of our different forage types. So, you can go out in a pasture, you can clip a forage sample and send, some of the pasture. The hard part about that is, pasture growth fluctuates so much throughout the year, and that quality is always going to be changing. So it's a little bit hard to capture the quality. It really is only representative of that kind of given time period when you took the sample. But hay, silage, all those things, we can go out and sample, send that, sample into the lab and get back that forage quality report that will tell us the analysis or the nutritive value of the components in that forage. One of the biggest things that influence this is maturity. We've talked about maturity, several times. Mentioned, cutting at the right maturity, making sure you're cutting at the right time. This is because maturity is really the biggest determinant behind the nutritional value of those forages. So, when forages are vegetative, small, they're leafy, they have higher energy, they have higher protein concentrations. And then as they grow and they get a little bit more mature, they get a little bit more stemmy, they get a little bit more fibrous, they have, lower energy, lower protein, a little bit less leaf concentration. So, if you're looking at it visually, that might look something like this. On the left, we have a really vegetative kind of leafy grass, and on the right, we have a much more mature forage. And the point in time at which you want to cut these forages or harvest these forages will really depend on your goals. If you're feeding that backyard pasture pony that I was mentioning earlier that doesn't really need, the highest quality because maybe it's a little bit overweight and it could use a little bit of a more mature forage, then you might want to lean a little bit more on the right side of the spectrum. Have something that's a little bit more mature. But if you're looking to feed, a lactating ewe or a lactating dairy cow, like you need that really high quality to support those requirements of that animal. So that's when you're going to want to be harvesting at a little bit more immature stage, capturing that quality. The downside is when you harvest at a more vegetative stage, there's an inverse relationship between those parameters of yield and quality. So as forages grow, that yield obviously is increasing. Those forages are growing, they're getting more mature, they're producing more. But on the flip side of things, like we just said, the quality is declining. So really when it comes to forage production, it's all about kind of finding that balance between yield and quality and, going a little bit more to one side or the other depending on your needs. So there's a whole bunch of other factors that also affect forage quality besides stage of maturity. And we don't really have time to go through all of those today, but I just wanted to throw up a quick list so that you're aware. Things like the leafiness, we mentioned that leaves can be lost during harvest. There are differences between our forage species, which we'll talk about in a second. Soil fertility and climate, the type of forage, the techniques and conditions during harvest or storage, anti-nutritive factors, all of those things can affect forage quality. So, You know, maturity is the biggest one, but there are a lot of other factors to consider as well. And then finally, you know, we don't have time to go through all the different forages today, but forages are really diverse. You know, we have a lot of different things that have been classified as forage, and they all have different uses and different niches and different ways that they can be used within a forage production system. Because we don't have time to go into all of them today, I kind of just wanted to break it down into a few of the bigger categories. So for example, cool season versus warm season forages. We've kind of already alluded to this, but a lot of our cool season forages are ones that thrive in those cooler, wetter climates. You know, they have that spring growth and that fall growth. They grow best, you know, in those kind of temperate conditions in the spring and fall. The warm season forages really grow best in those summer months when it's hotter and drier. They're, you know, they like that little bit of heat and need that heat in order to grow and produce. So if we think about what types of forages we have that fall into each of those categories, here in Maryland, we actually fall in what's commonly referred to as the transition zone. So, you know, in the northern half of the United States, they have predominantly more of the cool season grasses because, you know, of course, the weather is a little bit cooler, it doesn't get as hot or dry. In the southern part of the United States, those cool season grasses or legumes also don't thrive as well. It's too hot and dry for them. And then in the middle, we have kind of a transition zone. So here in Maryland, we're kind of in the northern end of that transition zone. So what we have is predominantly cool season forages, but we do also have the ability to grow some warm season forages. So we will see a mix of those kind of in our area. Some examples of some of each of those, these are all perennial grasses. So you can see on the left a list of some of the common cool season ones, things like orchard grass, timothy, bluegrass, fescue, etc. And on the right, some examples of warm season perennial grasses, things like Bermuda grass, big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. Those are all warm season forages. And I will mention these are all perennials, but we can have cool season and warm season forages that fall into the annual category as well. In addition to grasses, we have things like legumes. You know, grasses and legumes just are a little bit different in their growth and in their, you know, overall forage quality. From a nutrient standpoint, grasses usually tend to be a little bit lower in, you know, some things like protein or calcium. Legumes tend to be a little bit higher. Legumes are usually a little bit more calorie dense and a little bit lower in fiber. So as a result, they're usually a little bit more preferred. They usually have a little bit higher feed intake. They're kind of considered, you know, a slightly elevated plane of nutrition for those livestock. They have the added benefit of being able to fix nitrogen, which basically means they can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that's usable for that plant. So they usually require a little bit less inputs from fertilizer and or you know, manure application because they have the capability to do that. Examples of each, you know, we already talked about some of the grasses. Legumes, common legumes include things like alfalfa, red clover, white clover. Those are all examples of legumes that we will see in this area. And then finally, you know, we have perennial forages and annual forages. You can think about this kind of the same as you do, you know, plants that you might plant in your yard. Perennials are things that grow back every single year. Annuals are things that need to be replanted yearly. So perennials are a little bit slower to establish. They're a little bit slower growing. You know, they're kind of in it for the long haul. Annuals are a little bit quicker to establish, a little bit faster growing because they only survive for that, you know, 1 year period. So perennials are usually used for things like permanent pasture or hay fields, you know, long-term kind of production. Annuals are often used for things like double cropping, which you heard Nicole talk about, short-term forage production. You know, sometimes these are used in times of, you know, pasture renovation. If you're looking to produce, you know, short bursts of forage before you want to replant again into maybe a perennial pasture. Examples of some of the annuals that we would see would be things like annual ryegrass, some of the small grains, you know, wheat, oat, triticale. Those are all cool season annuals. And then we also have warm season annuals. Corn would be a warm season annual forage. Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, millet, all of those are annual forages that are becoming more and more popular within the forage production system as people kind of see the benefits and the niches of, maybe using both perennials and annuals in their forage system. So we kind of covered a lot of different information today, but I hope you kind of could see that forages, fill many, many different roles. Not only are they essential component of livestock rations for pretty much all of our livestock species, but they are often used as, cover crops or things of that nature as well with their, soil or other health benefits. They're very diverse. Not only do they come in many different forms, but we have, short-term and long-term forages. We have cooler growing forages, warmer growing forages. They grow at different times of the year. So really kind of no matter what sort of production system you're looking at, there's probably going to be some type of forage that will fit within that. There are a lot of factors affecting yield and quality of our forages. Maturity is probably the biggest one. So it's really important to consider maturity when we're thinking about forage production. And good management is essential. Whether that's a pasture, a hay produced, silage, all of it requires good management in order to have optimal forage production from there. And with that, I did throw my contact information on this last slide. If there's time, I'll be happy to take any questions.
So very good, Amanda. Thank you so much for that presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but we do have some time if folks have questions. You can either type them in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. Amanda's here, of course, and so is Dr. Fiorolino. She's still on with us. So if you have any burning questions about either of their presentations, this will be your time to ask them before they hop off. So in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen just to remind folks of our schedule tomorrow. So I don't see any questions right now. Oh, we do have a couple coming in. Here we go. I figured this would happen. Okay, so in what case would you use silage? Would you use small grains for silage instead of taking them to the mill as a grain crop? So that's one question. So I don't know if Amanda or Nicole or both of you want to handle that one.
Yeah, I guess I'll start and Nicole can chime in. So really, when you plant something like a small grain, usually when you're planting it, you'll have kind of a goal in mind. If you have livestock that you need to produce feed for, and you want that to be a forage source, then you would go under kind of the forage production system, plant, some of those forages to harvest either, graze or harvest as, maybe a small grain silage. If you're planting those because you want to produce grain, then that's more often when you kind of go the other route and plan to take those forages to the mill for processing. So it kind of depends on the goals of your operation and what you're looking to accomplish. They can be utilized kind of in both situations just a little bit differently. Nicole, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. You kind of start out your growing season with a plan of how you're going to use that crop. I guess I didn't really touch on this in my talk, but it would have been probably a very good point to make. So when you're harvesting a crop, typically we'll use small grains, for example, for grain. As it's coming through the combine, you're really just separating out the grain that is in that wheat head. The rest of the plant is basically discarded and kind of thrown back onto the field, versus when you're harvesting a crop for forage, you're keeping that entire plant. So same thing with corn that is harvested for grain, we're just keeping the kernels off of that cob, rest of the plant, again, basically being discarded. When corn's being harvested for silage, like Amanda described, you're taking that entire corn plant. So there, you have to have an idea in mind before you harvest that plant of what you're going to do with it, because your harvest is going to look different and your product that you end up with at the end is going to be different. So you really are going to make that decision well in advance.
Thank you for those explanations, Amanda and Nicole. We do have another question here, so this is a fun question. So how much does farm equipment cost?
A lot. I guess I don't know like the current prices off the top of my head, but like I would say it depends how big you're looking, you know, how big of an equipment you're looking for, and the type of the equipment, you know, even within like hay mowers, you know, there are several different types. Within the hay rakes, there are several different types. They come in different sizes. So it kind of depends, but I guess I would say, you know, you're easily looking, you know, $20,000-$30,000 for a mower or for a baler or, you know, something along those lines.
Yeah, Andy hit what I was going to say. My answer was going to be a lot. It is quite expensive, and Amanda said, you know, it really does depend on what you're looking for, and the size, you know, of your operation is going to depend on if you can cash flow that kind of equipment. I mean, depending on what you're looking for. I'm pricing out a tractor right now for my research operation, and we're looking at $40,000 to $50,000 just for the tractor. That's not including any of the implements. So I talked about tillage. That's another, you know, maybe $20,000. Don't quote me on any of these prices. I'm just kind of giving a rough estimate. You know, one of those self-propelled sprayers that I mentioned, for the most part, not too many individual operators can afford that. You're typically paying someone who works for, you know, maybe a service provider, you know, fertilizer dealer to come run their sprayer across your field. I'm not even sure how much those go for. A combine, I'll give you an idea. I bought a small research size combine, and it was still about $500,000 just for a small, not even a commercial size. So you're talking a lot of money.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I mean, a lot of equipment that's new or even a few years old, tractors, combines, choppers. I mean, expect hundreds of thousands of dollars to be paid for those equipment. If anybody's ever curious as to what new equipment costs, you can actually go on equipment manufacturers' websites and you can build and price equipment if you're ever curious. This is not a plug again for John Deere or anything, but they just released a new combine, and their brand new top of the line combine, the 9RX combines are over $900,000. So they're not cheap. A couple of other questions coming. I'm going to try and read them in order here. This question is for Amanda. So does the quality, so the forage quality of hay or other forages vary according to the season?
Yes. I mean, in general, you know, maturity is the bigger player. You know, you can harvest good quality hay in the spring, you can harvest good quality hay in the fall. But that being said, the season affects like the growth rate of that forage a lot. So, you know, in the spring, hay is growing really quickly, and it can, you know, those grasses can start to get mature and like a little bit lower in quality a lot faster. And in the summertime, when things are growing really slow, you know, you might not see as much of that kind of lush growth. And then in the fall time of the year, you know, when, you know, weather like we've had lately, it's kind of cool, wet weather, you know, things are growing rapidly again. So the season does play a role in the quality of the forage, but it's not the only thing, if that helps.
So I think that's a good explanation. Thank you, Amanda. There's another question going back to the cost of equipment. And it says, do farmers share the cost of equipment?
I can talk a little bit about that. Sometimes, sort of, which is our classic extension answer. I think as we can use the example of a silage chopper, for example. In my area, the Upper Shore, there's still maybe about a handful of dairy operations left. So each individual dairy does not own their own silage chopper. There's one dairy farm who has purchased a fairly new chopper, and that farmer will come around and chop silage for other farmers as well, and other farmers pay that farmer for using their equipment. We call that like custom work. So they'll come and Farmer Matt will come and chop everyone else's silage for them, and then he gets paid for that equipment. And so that's why I mean, kind of. Typically, one operation or individual farmers or entities will purchase equipment, and they can charge others to come in for the use of that equipment on other operations, and that helps in those individual farmers and entities be able to afford the investment in that equipment if they don't have enough acres on their own entity to justify that purchase.
So I think that explains it pretty well. There is a comment here in the chat that says, at that rate, with the cost of equipment, I'm sure that it is completely outdated before it is even paid off. So I don't know if anybody has any comments to add to that. But I will say with a lot of new farm machinery, a lot of it is leased sometimes by operators. So they keep it for a couple of years and then they upgrade to the latest and greatest. And a lot of old machinery still is in use in agriculture. One of the big reasons is because old machines are much easier to work on than new machines. A lot of the software packages and equipment that's needed to maintain new machinery is proprietary, and dealers have to do that service. So I don't know if Nicole or Amanda want to make any other comments on that.
Yeah, I can make a quick comment. I know my husband, who recently got out of farming, but when he was still farming, created an entity and purchased a combine. And I was surprised at how similar it was to buying a car. I mean, they got a 5-year loan. So they had to know, they had to have the numbers worked out to know what to charge per acre of harvesting and how many acres per year had to be harvested with that combine to make that annual payment. And, they only had a 5-year loan. So it just was a lot bigger payment than our car payment. But, so farmers tend to be good, if they are going to make that investment in new equipment. And I echo Andy's point that, older equipment still functions and, sometimes is often preferred by farmers. But folks who are going to make that investment in newer equipment, they typically know exactly how many hours, how many acres that equipment needs to cover in a year to be able to make their payment. And most folks won't jump in and make that investment if they're not sure that they can cover those costs to make that payment.
So that's a good point. If anybody's ever curious, at least from the grain side of things, production cost per acre, we do have some crop budgets at University of Maryland Extension, and you can sort of play around with those on a spreadsheet to get an idea of actually what it does cost to produce an acre of corn. And that's going to be in the resource that we will send to you afterwards that Nicole provided. So it's kind of interesting to look at. We do have some questions coming in here. So with hay, it was shown from one of the graphs that higher moisture content led to a higher internal temperature and therefore a risk of fire. Does a similar risk occur with baleage and or silage with higher moisture content?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the difference there is the presence or absence of the oxygen component. So In dry hay, when you have a higher moisture content, that hay is, open to the air, and that the respiration that's going on within that bale, combined with the high temperatures and the exposure to air, is where you get the fire risk. With baleage or silage, the key with both of those, because you're using or you're wanting that higher moisture content, that's why both of those practices require oxygen exclusion. So, the plastic wrap that goes around the baleage, the cover that goes over the silage trench, those are basically getting that air out and away from that forage, allowing that basically fermentation process to happen, and then that remains in an anaerobic environment, which is what keeps that forage stable and prevents it from, risks of fire and spoilage and those kinds of things.
So great question. I don't see any other ones in the chat at this point. If I missed any, somebody just unmute yourself and let me know. But just to reiterate, we will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock. The same Zoom registration, and we will, you can see the schedule there on your screen for tomorrow's session. We will go a little bit longer just because, as you can see, we have a few more speakers with some more finer details, I guess, within each topic. So did I miss anyone with questions? Not hearing any, so we will adjourn for today. Thank you all for hopping on, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So we will see you then. Thank you very much, guys.